Welcome. Thank you very much, and it is a great pleasure to be back. You may have noticed that there was a comic book about consciousness that hopefully you picked up. If you didn't, I think there are more copies back there, and you're probably wondering, a comic book? What's that all about? So let me explain. My radio show, to the best of our knowledge, commissioned this comic book as a companion project to the radio series that Richard was just mentioning, the 6-hour series, Meet Your Mind, A User's Guide to the Science of Consciousness, which has just started airing on a bunch of public radio stations. It'll be coming to WNYC very soon. And we thought it would be fun to do a comic book. And so we've never done anything like this before, so I hope you'll pick it up and enjoy it. Now, last month, we had our first event at the New York Academy, and we had a great conversation on the nature of consciousness and the age-old mind-brain problem. How does the physical stuff in the brain produce mental experience, which is entirely immaterial? Of course, it's one of the great unanswered questions in all of science. It's a question that philosophers have debated for centuries. So I have to say I was kind of surprised after the discussion. There was someone from the audience came up and said, well, that was good, but if you want a real mystery, you got to talk about memory. So here we are. And when you start to think about some of the questions, they really get to be kind of mind-boggling. How does the brain actually create a memory? Can we ever call up a pure, untainted memory, kind of like we can on a computer? You know, we grab the file, and there it is, and it's an exact replica, and unless something bad goes on with the computer. Or is the act of remembering always, to some degree, recreating a new memory? And just why do we place so much value on having a good memory? What's the connection between our memory and our sense of self? And if memory really is the core of our self-identity, what's going to happen to us once scientists start to erase certain bad memories? And there is now a concerted research effort to be able to do just that. So we have a terrific panel to talk about these and other questions, and let me introduce them in alphabetical order. André Aciman is a novelist, essayist, and memoirist. His acclaimed books include Out of Egypt and Alibis, essays on Elsewhere. He chairs the PhD program in comparative literature at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Joseph LeDoux is a neuroscientist at New York University, where he directs the Center for Neural Science. He's the author of The Emotional Brain and The Synaptic Self, and he's also a singer and songwriter in the rock band The Amygdaloids. Daniel Schacter is a psychologist at Harvard University who has published hundreds of scientific articles on memory. His books include Searching for Memory and The 7 Sins of Memory. And Alison Winter is a historian of science and medicine at the University of Chicago. She's the author of Mesmerized Powers of Mind in Victorian Britain, and most recently, Memory, Fragments of a Modern History. So it is great to have all of you here. Joe, let me start with you. What is the neuroscience of memory? How does the brain actually create memories?
Well, that's maybe a tough place to jump in, but you know, basically the sort of dogma in neuroscience today is that memories are created through the process of learning, which depends on synaptic plasticity in the brain. So what that means is that anytime you take in some information from the outside world, that information is going to travel through neural pathways, and those pathways will make terminations in various parts of the brain. And when that information carries something significant, something happens to at the termination where these pathways end, which is to change the strength of the input to fire the output. So if you have information coming in and it is, let's say, I don't know, just a light bulb flashing or something, it has no meaning, but then all of a sudden the light bulb leads to Hershey's Kiss or something, and you like that. So the next time you see the light bulb, you'll have a better response to it. That's simple Pavlovian conditioning. But the way that would take place in your brain is by the light bulb coming in as light, the taste of the kiss coming in as a taste, and they would meet up at some point in the brain, and the connections between those two would be strengthened, such that the Hershey's Kiss would create a strong response, the light bulb a weak response, but by virtue of the strong response, something is changed in the weak pathway, so that the weak pathway now is able to activate the information that's stored and retrieve the memory.
So can we talk about the creation of a single memory? I mean, is a memory a physical thing? Is it a collection of a discrete group of neurons?
Again, the dogma in the field, whether this is absolutely correct or not, I don't know, but the idea is that a memory is a set of synaptic connections, a set of weights on those synaptic connections. Now, when we talk about synaptic plasticity, we're not talking about wholesale rewiring of the brain. So like, you've got a superhighway carrying in vision, another superhighway carrying in sound into your brain. You're not going to change the structure of those pathways. What you're going to change through learning is the endpoints, the very fine ends where the connections are being made. So the idea is that at these fine endpoints, the strength of the connections are changed so that a stimulus that isn't able to activate the output of that circuit is now able to, because of the change, the synaptic plasticity that allows it to be more effective.
I guess I'm still trying to figure out whether a memory is an actual thing, a
no,
physical
it's not.
thing.
It's a representation probably across millions of synapses distributed throughout one brain area or perhaps even multiple brain areas. But when it's reactivated by the stimulus, those things coalesce in time, in space and time, to retrieve the memory. But it's not like a bottle that you have in your hand, you put it on the shelf, you take it out, you put it back in, and so forth. It's not like that. It's a very, it's amazing that it all works.
Well, Dan, let me turn to you. Is long-term memory an entirely different thing than short-term memory?
Probably not entirely different, but there are definitely distinctions. So, for example, we know that in psychology and neuroscience, when we talk about short-term memory, we're typically talking about memory that lasts over a period of seconds. In everyday parlance, we're more likely to think of our short-term memory as something maybe that lasts for the last few weeks. But in our field, we talk about it as something that lasts for seconds or minutes, and long-term memory beyond that. And we know, for example, one reason we know they're to some extent different is that, for example, there are certain patient populations with specific kinds of brain damage who can lose one type and not the other. So famous amnesic patients who have had damage in a part of the brain known as the hippocampus and some nearby structures deep in your temporal lobe, they have a pretty good short-term memory that could hold on to a few bits of information for a few seconds, but if you would distract these individuals, they can't create a long-term memory that's then accessible much later on. There are other kinds of neuropsychological patients who have the exact opposite syndrome. They have damage elsewhere in the brain. For example, there's some well-studied cases of damage in a part of the parietal lobe in the left hemisphere, where that will selectively disrupt the ability to hold on to information over brief periods of time, verbal information. They can't hold on over brief periods of time, but they can get information, curiously, into long-term memory. So from that neuropsychological evidence that we've known about for a long time, there clearly is a distinction. Having said that, they're not 100% distinct. There are some ways the two clearly interact. Short-term can influence long-term and vice versa.
Now, I think there's a common assumption that there are really two parts to memory and recalling memory. There's the storage, somehow it gets planted into our brain somewhere, and then there is the recalling part. And my understanding of modern neuroscience is it's more or less assumed that there's no such thing as calling back up a pure memory. So I guess the question then is the problem, if we define the problem as not being able to retrieve a perfect memory, is the problem in the storage, or is it the problem in the recall, or both?
It can be in either or both, just depending on a host of circumstances. So, for example, when we encode information from the world, the mind doesn't act like a camera or photograph, just taking a literal picture of what's out there. What's coming in is interacting with what's already there. And so, for example, when we have an experience, part of what we store about that experience may be our own reactions to that experience, or inferences that we make about what's happening, whether it's actually happening or not. And those inferences can go in and be part of our recording of the event. And so in that sense, if we infer something that didn't happen, but we think is likely to happen, or we're concerned might happen, we could have a distorted memory from the very beginning. Other kinds of distortions in memory do occur more at the time of retrieval. We know from actually some of Joe LeDoux's work from his lab and other labs, and you've alluded to this earlier, that when you recall a memory, it's not just simply a readout. You've got to store that memory or consolidate that memory all over again, and the memory at that time can be vulnerable to changes from outside influences. So there are lots of points along the way where a memory can be distorted or changed.
Well, I'm struck by the language you've used. You've talked about recording a memory, which is the kind of thing we talk about with our recording a song, for instance, or recording a movie, and then there's the playback. And Alison, you are a historian who studied this kind of thing, and the technology metaphors that we use. Has there been a change in thinking about how scientists and how the public at large has approached the thinking about memory, sort of based on the technologies that we're familiar with?
It's interesting that I think for as long as we've got records for how people represent memory, there's been a relationship between thinking about recording devices and thinking about how our brains and minds store our past experiences. So from the ancient idea of the wax tablet, you draw on the wax tablet, and the wax can soften over time, and the information gets blurred. Through photography, the idea that maybe our minds take photographs of our experiences. There's been a metaphorical, but maybe more complex than a straightforward metaphorical relationship between thinking about external information storage and internal storage of our life experience. And I think that one of the things that's striking in the 20th century is you can see as new devices were developed and became widespread, there was a kind of circular relationship between how people thought about them and memory. So once you have devices like the wire recording and the tape recorder and the motion picture film, for the first time you've got devices that can store information and include the passage of time. And claims about memory began to be made that we had recording devices that had a playback feature in them, so that we could, in principle, have flashbacks, a term from cinema, early cinema, for re-experiencing the past in real time, a claim that is hard to find before the existence of those recording devices. So at each stage, when you get these new devices, people thought, that's how our memories work. Or other people said, only the dummies think that's how our memories work. Our memories don't work anything like that, but that's a good example of what not to think.
So is the computer now the dominant metaphor that we use for thinking about memory?
I'm not sure I'd be the person to answer that. I suspect possibly not, but I expected when I was doing my research that computers would have been that there would have been analogies made to computers in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and they weren't. The devices that people made reference to were tape recorders, and eventually to personal computers. So it was a personal device on which you could store a file. And something I'm very curious about is whether the new digital technologies have helped people think about memories in a more constructive way, because we no longer take, say, pictures that are the same unless we do a lot of work to change them. You know, the old photography, you'd had to work hard to change that. But now you take your pictures and you can alter them before anybody else sees them. And you know, it's a much more dynamic sense of how you store information.
Now, there is not only a science of memory, there's also a literature of memory. And André, you have spent much of your life tapping memories, sometimes your own, I think sometimes other people who you've known to write your essays, your memoirs, your fiction. What do you make of the science of memory? Do you think about this kind of thing at all, or are you working with memory in a totally different vein?
No, I'm in a room by myself, inventing my life. No, I think it's very interesting because the language of the computers is, obviously it's a metaphor that's so dominant and we use it all the time. And the one aspect of it that I've become very conscious of as a writer of memoirs is the feature called, do you want to save this, this document? If you do, you will overwrite the previous one. How many of you are familiar with the word overwrite? Okay, it means you destroy, but you instantly replace it with something else. And that has become basically my approach to writing about memory, because initially when I started writing from my memories, it was kind of easy. I remember X, I write Y, there are some sort of distortions that are unavoidable, word tenses, verb tenses, certain language makes necessary certain alterations. And then there's the fact that, you want to embroider. Who doesn't want to do that? That's humiliating. I'll change it. I'll blame someone else. Nobody will know, okay? The changes that you make in a memoir are sort of legion. But what really began to affect me is when I wrote about my childhood growing up in Alexandria in Egypt. And that was all fine because I remembered a great deal. In fact, I had forgotten nothing, much less forgiven anyone for the bad things they've done to me. But I went back to Alexandria because somebody said, why don't you write about going back? Gee, you left Egypt, now you're back in Egypt, write about that. And I walked down the streets that I had described in my book. And here comes the interesting part when you talk about memory. First of all, I had forgotten nothing. I could walk and never get lost. There was no point in even pretending I didn't know where I was. I knew where I was. Even the smells of the tramway stations still smelled like urine as they had when I was a child. Nothing had changed. So that's all fine. Except there was a change. I had written a scene when I first started writing this book about a walk I took with my brother. And this is all out already, so this is not a confession. I wrote about a walk I took with my brother on the last day in Egypt. And then the editor said, that brother of yours, he's one child too many in this book. Can we eliminate him? I said, sure, you want this? We'll do it in a second. So we changed that. I removed my brother, and some of the dialogue I had with him, I kind of reconstructed, so I was having it as an internal dialogue with myself. But if you want to do sort of the archaeology of the scene, you just will figure out that it's really the missing dark brother who's still there but no longer visible. But then something else occurred. I was walking down the same street, once with him, once without him, and now I'm on the street itself. And here's what happened. I had overwritten the scene. I did not remember what had really happened on that street. And if you ask me today, I remembered, or I think I remembered, the only document I have of that memory is what I had written the first time. But that's a document. I don't have that memory any longer. I erased it.
And you erased it because you're saying you rewrote it.
Yes.
You rewrote it to create a new memory.
Right. And so, I mean, you can use quantum metaphors if you want. There are 2 versions, 3 versions, and they can't all be true, but actually I don't know which one is the true one. I have forgotten what really happened on that night.
Well, let me turn to the scientists here. What do you make of a story like that?
Well, that's exactly the kind of research we do on a daily basis.
Do you want to look?
No. I mean, you brought this up earlier, Steve, but the idea that memories are, each time they're taken out, they have to be put back in. Maybe, Dan, you might have mentioned. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we found, this was about 12 years ago, is that this had been sort of known for a long time, but kind of forgotten and not paid much attention to until we did this actually in the brain. What we did was we studied rats. So we made the rats afraid of a stimulus by giving them a sound that's paired with a shock, and then they express a fear response to the sound. But then we injected a drug into the brain that blocks protein synthesis. And we injected the protein synthesis blocker into the amygdala, which is where these memories are formed. And we knew from other studies that we've done, if we block protein synthesis before learning, the animals don't form a long-term lasting memory. But in this case, Kareem Nader, who was a postdoc in my lab, asked the question, what would happen if we block protein synthesis after the retrieval of the memory? And when we did that and tested the animals a couple of days later, they no longer were afraid of the stimulus. So why did that happen? Well, the idea is that each time you take a memory out, it becomes vulnerable. It gets changed in some way. It becomes susceptible to change. It's now in a labile state. So what you then store at that point is the memory you then carry forward with. And basically the bottom line, and we don't know if this happens for every kind of memory, some kinds of memory, all instances of memory, and there are lots of debates now about exactly under what conditions this applies. But the bottom line, if you take it to the most extreme example, would be your memory is only as good as your last memory of a situation.
But it sounds like you're saying that basically every memory we have is a fake memory to some degree.
That may be true. It may be faked in a very small way that is imperceptible and meaningless, or it could be fake in a very profound way. And do you agree?
Yeah, no, I do agree. I think the phenomena that Joe was just talking about is well established. There are still discussions about whether it applies to all memories, but I think one thing we have to keep in mind, and when Joe was mentioning that some of these changes which occur when we bring memories to mind, and they may go back in influenced by what's happening at the time and therefore be subtly different, that can coexist with a reasonable degree of accuracy. Our memory system is not so inaccurate that it constantly gets into trouble, though it can. So one of the challenges for memory scientists is try to balance off, on the one hand, the evidence that memory can be distorted in various ways through the reconsolidation kind of effect that Joe talked about, through the fact that sometimes we take away mainly the meaning from our experience as opposed to all the details. We need to balance that off with the fact that we can and do often exhibit very accurate memory. And we're capable of storing a lot of detail that's accurate about what happened. So a big challenge in memory is trying to see exactly how those things line up with one another.
Do neuroscientists have any tools for distinguishing true from false memories?
Yeah, we do. One way that we've been working on in my lab for over 15 years now is through neuroimaging techniques like functional MRI, earlier PET scans. And in these kinds of experiments, we put people in a scanner, and we're basically measuring blood flow in their brain, which will increase in parts of the brain that become active when you do a particular task, memory or otherwise. And what the functional MRI scanner allows you to do is localize those changes in blood flow, or actually changes in the level of blood oxygenation level in the brain, very precisely within a few millimeters. So you can put people in the scanner and you can try to measure brain activity when they're recalling a true memory or a false memory. Now, how would you induce a false memory in a brain scanner? Well, there are various ways of doing it. Do we have a minute to induce a false memory in the audience?
Sure.
Okay. Some of you may know this procedure. I'm sure Joe does. But I'm going to read out a list of words, and I want you to pay attention to those words. And I believe that it's very likely that half of you are going to experience false memory within the next minute or two. Here are the words: candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good, taste, tooth, nice, honey, soda, chocolate, heart, cake, eat, pie. Okay, this is kind of standard laboratory memory stuff. We give you a bunch of words, and then we could now put you in the scanner, and we could give you a memory test. We could ask you to recall the words on your own. You could try to do that. Or I could give you a test. I could say, was this word on the list? Taste. Yeah? Okay. Pretty good. It was on the list. How about this word? Point. Was that on the list? Anybody think point was on the list? Okay, this is a very good audience. We'll continue. How about sweet? Yes. Everyone's got sweet. How many people are sure sweet was on the list? Most people? Sweet was not on the list. So I told you a minute ago that I was going to induce a false memory, and it was actually more than 50% of you is most of you. What's going on there? All the words that I said are related, associated to sweet: candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good, etc. The point of that is to illustrate one way a certain kind of false memory can be created. More important, you can do that with a lot of different associated words. So we can put you in a brain scanner, and we, after having heard a bunch of lists like that, and we can look at brain activity when you're accurately remembering that taste was on the list versus when you're absolutely convinced sweet was on the list and it's not. And we can say, are there similarities, are there differences? And we and others have now been doing this for 15 years, and there are a lot of similarities. The activation maps, when you remember accurately that taste was on the list and accurately that sweet was on the list, look very similar in many ways, but there are reliable differences that turn up again and again across studies. For example, we saw in an early study back in the mid-90s, and it's shown up now in several others, been replicated and extended, that when you remember that taste was on the list, you heard me saying that, there's a little more activity in the auditory cortex of the brain than when you remember that sweet was on the list, because you never heard it. Several studies have shown that. Other studies have been done with, for example, visual shapes that are kind of a visual analog of what we just did. So I show you a lot of shapes that kind of look like one another, and then I throw in one later on that looks like what you saw before, but it wasn't really there. And you can look at brain activity with neuroimaging for shapes you actually remember, and for the look-alike shape that you think was there but wasn't there. A lot of overlap in the brain, but we find that there are parts of the visual cortex now that respond more strongly for the shape you really did see, as opposed to the one that looks like a lot of things you saw.
Well, let me bring the historian back into the discussion here. Has there been a change in thinking over the decades about how people think about, I mean, whether we have total recall of memory? Is there sort of changing opinions about that?
Well, of course. Although something I was thinking as you were speaking is that the idea of memory being this constructive thing is not new. And one of the things that was striking to me listening to this exchange is that what is new is the incredible broad plausibility of this reconstructive idea. Back in the 1920s and 30s, there was a scientist who many people here have heard of called Frederick Bartlett, who argued that memories were very much like what you guys described, but without the neurosciences part of it, that memories are continually constructed, and he produced false memories of various kinds through similar tricks to this, and he gave people stories that they had to repeat back, and he did a lot of this stuff, but without the imaging, and I think without the rats, and he wasn't actually all that influential outside his own community in England for much of the century. He's really big now.
So why wasn't he influential back then?
I think there were reasons why he wasn't influential then, and I think there's some interesting reasons possibly why he is influential now. One of the reasons why he wasn't influential was that the idea of a perfect recording device inside our heads was incredibly appealing. The idea that we have motion picture cameras in our neurons that capture frame by frame everything we experience, or high fidelity stereos were really trendy in the 50s, but very few people could afford them. But popular science articles said we had them in our brains, so everybody could share in that. So the idea of a perfect recording device, partly I think because of the novelty and popularity of these devices as they came out on the market one by one, that's probably part of it. And also perhaps one component of psychoanalysis includes, which was incredibly influential for much of the 20th century and not so much now, was the idea that we can repress memories that stay intact, and then by repressing them we store them in a particularly pristine way, and then they return sometimes. So those were reasons why it wasn't popular, but I think there might be a reason why it is popular now, separate from the effectiveness of all of the cool new research techniques that you guys have. And that might be related to Andre's story, that we're so we're so comfortable with changing records, and we have this notion of rewriting and overwriting and saving files. It's something that we do, but we haven't done it. We started doing it in the 80s. We didn't really do it so much before, and it strikes me that that might be one of the reasons why when Joe does this research and Daniel does this research, it takes off in terms of it has a much broader audience, perhaps, than it would have had. Might have taken a lot more work for you to convince people outside the research community that this is a possible idea.
Actually, I don't think so, because I mean what happened with our work was, because we were basically rewriting fear memories, we started getting calls almost immediately from someone who wanted to have their ex-wife's memory erased, and a variety of things like that. But more seriously, I mean, there are a lot of people who have trouble with difficult memories, traumatic memories, that want some relief, and they've tried everything, and nothing seems to really kind of get rid of this incredibly painful and aversive emotional arousal that occurs when they have these recurrent memories that just keep coming back to their mind over and over again. So there's a great demand out there for something that can alter memory, but what that means is then debatable. You raised the question in your sort of list of questions at the beginning: what does it mean to the self?
Sure.
Well,
I think a lot of people would say that the self is, I mean, the foundation of our sense of self is memory.
Sure it is. We have to remember who we are to be that person from day to day and year to year.
And yet, as I was sort of thinking about this coming over here, I was thinking, you know, if you were kind of a perfect Buddhist living in the moment, would you be experiencing without memory? Is that possible?
You'll have to ask a Buddhist.
We don't think so.
He won't remember the answer.
But isn't the case of HM a possible example of this? This is a case that you could speak to way better than me. But if I'm gonna get myself in trouble here. But
yeah, that's a famous amnesic patient who had his hippocampus and other parts of the temporal lobe taken out to produce relief from epilepsy back in the 1950s, and as a result of that could not form new memories that he could later consciously recall. But he did have some old memories left. So when you talk about memory and how it underpins the sense of self, you do have to distinguish between, on the one hand, people who can't create new memories but still have old memories left, as most amnesic patients do. They do have some still foundation in old memories or general memories.
HM did still have the sense of self.
But there's another component to his story that might be interesting here, which is, as I understand it, people would come and talk to him about something, and he would respond the same way, even though he couldn't remember. He couldn't remember what his response had been. So, for instance, I think his brain is stored in San Diego. He died, and
in 2008.
He must have agreed to that, and I bet he was asked many times whether this was okay. And his responses to all sorts of questions were similar, and so perhaps you could say that he had an enduring and continuous, maybe in that respect not a sense of self, but a self that was consistently responding in a way that had a character.
Maybe this is a good point to bring in that we have different kinds of memory that are stored in our brains in different ways. And Dan was very influential in this, in the idea of this very early on. But you know, if the kinds of things I think you're talking about are things that might be stored in the form of habits and implicit unconscious memories that then come out automatically.
So it's still memory.
There are memories. So riding a bicycle, you have to learn how to ride a bicycle by planning every movement at first, but then once you know how to do it, thinking about it probably is bad for your performance.
Well, let's bring the memoirs back into this discussion. Do you think, I mean, because you deal so much with memory in your writing, do you see that as kind of the root of self, of character in your writing?
No, I think that, I mean, I'm going to shock most people. I don't think we have a really sort of central core self. I don't, it's basically, this is just a guess I'm taking. But I do think that we have selves that are out there like, you know, milk bottles in an amusement park. You know, the kind that you shoot, they're all there. We have all ourselves out there. And I mean, it's really distasteful to think of yourself as one of those many milk bottles, but that you change from one person to another. I mean, there's so many of us in us that for example, to answer your situation, you know, if a person has very good judgment, forget memory, he could have zero memory but has perfect judgment. Every time you ask him a question, can we store your brain, seeing that it is absolutely different from all other brains, his good judgment will tell you, yes, you can. But the sense of an identity that is there, and all you need to do is sort of take out parts of it, I don't think we're made that way. We're more like things that happen to inhabit the same body, and some of them don't even talk to each other because they don't get along. And if they don't get along, you're probably seeing it shrink. But the sense is that there's so many of us, and many of these characters don't even share memories. Of course they do share memories, but to go back to one of the easiest metaphors, because I think writers only think in metaphors, the easiest metaphor for memory, I think, is still Sigmund Freud's, the one where he describes the city of Rome and civilization and its discontents. And the interesting part, he says, you know, it's like Rome. Rome had one layer, then somebody built a new layer on top of it, and then there's another layer, and then there's, you know, medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, neoclassical Rome, and they all are there, sort of one tier on top of the other. Well, that's totally, I mean, Freud liked to think this way because it helped him. But we don't work this way. Think of the milk bottles again. Those tiers are constantly shifting one into the other, and the memories are altered. But he did say something that was very interesting, at least to me. He said that in some cases, the original city, the original frame of Rome, has been destroyed, or let's say totally repressed, to use his language. But what we have are the ruins of the reconstructions. And that's really a metaphor that works for me. I work
that works for you? That sounds incredibly depressing.
Well, why do you think my characters are all sad? No, but it works for me because it gives me a sense of how I operate, how I remember, in the sense that I can't remember the original situation, but I know I can't remember it. Most people will swear that this is what happened. I know I can't remember, and therefore what I have instead is sort of the detritus of what happened after it. And that too is now imperfect because it has been almost obliterated. And
I don't know that it's sad. It depends
to be trafficking in the ruins of our sort of, you know, half-baked memories?
Yeah, because they're ruined by our experiences. They're only ruined in the sense that they are deconstructed.
Right.
So it depends on whether you think that memories to be good and valuable are these things that are perfect, but they're only perfect if you don't move on, if you don't live. And if you live, then you're changing, and so you're ruining something, perhaps in the sense of eating dinner, and then you've got the leftovers, which are ruined, but then you can make something else with them the next day, and that ideas of memory as a sort of active, dynamic thing is.
I think that raises a very important point that a lot of these seeming flaws in memory, I call them the sins of memory a number of years ago, they seem to be defects in the way that memories work, but a lot of us think that they're really kind of just the flip side of good things in memory that have a certain cost. So in the case of reconsolidation, you're updating your memory when you reconsolidate. You're making it more current. You don't want to necessarily be bogged down with what's less relevant, so maybe it's a good thing that you update your memory, and in doing so you may leave some past experience behind. In the case of the false memory induction that where most people were remembering sweet, you're kind of remembering the gist, or you're remembering the important things of what I said in that list that all had to do with sweet. You remembered that perfectly well, so there's a lot of accuracy in your memory. You just didn't quite get the exact word correct. So a lot of these memory errors may just be the flip side of good things in memory, and it really brings to the fore the question of, well, what do you think memory really is for? What's the function of memory? Bartlett talked about this a lot in his famous book that Alison was talking about from 1932, and I think it's influenced people who work on this kind of constructive memory angle. We think, for example, that a lot of, even though we tend to think of memory as really being all about the past and allowing us to reminisce about what happened, that it's really much more about allowing us to prepare for the future.
And unless you are called up as an expert witness in a criminal case.
Well, and then some of the problems are exposed.
I mean, should we be casting doubt on all those kinds of memories in legal case? I mean, obviously there are profound legal questions here. There are ethical questions here. Should we be much more dubious about what we hear in testimony?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I have a question for you, Dan, and it has to do with reunions. I mean, how many of you have gone to school reunions of one side? And here you have a few people who remember being, maybe they didn't like each other, but suddenly because of time they kind of like each other, and they're sitting together reminiscing about a particular professor who was either lovely or detestable, whatever. And they're sitting there and say, do you remember X saying that? And one person will say, no, I don't. And then the third person would say, yes, but he did say that because he was talking to you. And suddenly, from nothing, a memory that you didn't know you had, it is suddenly resurrected. Now, it may not be resurrected at all. You just manufactured it on the spur of the moment.
Right. It could be accurate, or it could be some mixture of accuracy or inaccuracy. It depends on the circumstances. And certainly in legal cases, I agree with Joe that, yeah, we do have to be skeptical. Again, it doesn't mean that memory is necessarily inaccurate, but people need to be aware of the fact that it can be inaccurate and be educated about the circumstances in which that's more or less likely. And actually, we have to give a lot of credit to the state of New Jersey here, because in a recent case, there was a decision handed down by a New Jersey court that resulted in the development of much more sophisticated and scientifically informed jury instructions that are now being used as of September 4th, I believe, in cases in New Jersey where memory is an issue, where the jurors are instructed and told things like, memory is not a video recorder. Here are some of the ways in which memory can go wrong. And so I think as long as that starts getting more in the discussion and people don't go in with a naive assumption that just because somebody says something with confidence, like everyone here confidently said that sweet was on the list, it wasn't, that people can exercise appropriate skepticism. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that all memory is wrong. You just have to be aware of the possibility that it is, why it is, and the circumstances under which that's more or less likely.
So where does this leave the reader of memoirs? Because supposedly a memoir is true. I mean, what you're writing about happened. That's the difference between a memoir and a novel, right?
That's what they say. No, I mean, we have the very famous case, I forget his name, was it Frey?
James Frey.
James Frey, okay. And he basically lied about things that he remembered that never happened. He basically swore to that they were true. Well, that was a mistake. You know, you go to jail when you swear to something that you probably could have said, I don't quite remember, and gotten away with it. But that, for a writer, it's very important when you write about the things that you remember. And I've become sort of now, I write about memory all the time, but when I was writing my memoir, I wanted to be as accurate as possible, knowing full well that the way I describe it to people is, I have furniture in the room. The furniture is all intact. These are the items that were in the room, but I've moved the furniture around. And it's up to you to realize, to determine whether I was lying or whether I was not lying, just shifting the inflection of the truth. And
well, how do you define what's lying or what's not?
I can't, and I wouldn't bother, because it's not important.
But you're making a distinction between emotional truth and factual truth. Yes,
because ultimately it is the emotional truth that makes us. If we have a center, it's all in our emotions, and that's really what matters to a writer. It's I don't care that I wasn't crossing the street with X or Y, but with somebody else. What matters is what are the feelings that I had while I was crossing the street. And ultimately that's what a memoir is about. And people will say, no, that's a novel. I couldn't care less, you know, what they think. Yes?
I had a question for you that's exactly about that. And in my earlier work, I worked on people in the 19th century, and I think they would have said that there's an absolute difference between writing your own life and writing a novel. And I suspect that people now would say it's not so clear, or many people would. And I wonder whether you think there's been a change in recent years in how people think about memoirs and one's writing about one's own life.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I direct a writing center, and people who apply to the writing center, there are people in nonfiction, always a narrowing number of them. People in fiction, always solid, but the people writing memoirs, for all kinds of reasons, you know, for their grandchildren, or because they want to understand themselves, and they think that by writing about their lives, they will basically, this is the point, they're writing about their lives in order to give their lives a narrative. In other words, you consolidate something. When you write about your memories, you give them a kind of narrative arc, and that arc could be a falsification of your entire life, but the narrative itself is quite authentic.
And is that a newish thing?
I think, yes, people are writing memoirs all the time. There are more memoirs coming out. I mean, this is something that's been going on for the past 20 years. Everybody is writing a memoir.
So it fits the science.
It does, yes. You'll have more people to investigate. But I do think that the very sense that you know, in writing a memoir, you are trying to, I mean, there are many things that could be going on. The two that are most noteworthy is that you want to retain information. You don't want it to go away. You don't want it to waste. On the other hand, you also want that retention to produce something, which is what we call meaning. You want your life, or at least the narrative of your life, to have a bigger meaning than those incidentals that really make up your, you know, tragic life. But the ultimate thing is that you want a revelation. Writing a memoir without the aim of producing a revelation that you didn't know about, but that the process of writing it finally yielded, would be a waste of time. And
I mentioned at the beginning that there is now an effort among some scientists to figure out how to erase traumatic memories. I mean, there are all kinds of interesting questions here, scientific questions, ethical questions as well. Joe, are scientists going to be able to figure out how to do this? How to pinpoint specific memories and just wipe them out of someone's mind?
Right. So I mean, that's the kind of hype about this kind of work, but that's not really, I think, what's happening. When we do these kinds of experiments, for example, in animals, we're focusing on brain systems that work implicitly or unconsciously, and I want to come back to that in a second. And what they do is, when they're active, they cause the body to respond, which then can create all sorts of other consequences in the brain and mind. So we're not in the case of fear, we're not really looking at fear in the animal. What we're looking at are fear responses or defense responses. And this is a kind of memory that has no conscious correlate. In a human that has damage to the amygdala, the person can no longer be conditioned to have a bodily response to a tone that's been paired with a shock, but they still remember having been conditioned. So it's not, the system is working beneath the surface. In fact, probably most of our memories are like that. The reason we have memory, again, is not, as Dan said, it's not to reminisce. Memory evolved as a mechanism for storing information about the past to predict behavior in the future, or allow your behavior to be more adaptive in the future. So it's about, the original memories are going to be systems in very kind of primitive animals that allow them to adapt behaviorally to the environment, not to reminisce about the past when they experience the environment.
Well, let me ask you a more pointed question. Suppose a soldier comes back from the war in Afghanistan, has witnessed horrible things, particularly maybe one particular incident that has haunted him, suffers from post-traumatic stress. Will scientists be able to basically remove that trauma, at least to a large degree?
What is likely to unfold over the next few years is the ability to weaken the implicit unconscious emotional impact of the memory, not the memory itself. Because the drugs that are available now and the methods that are available now are primarily affecting the amygdala-based memories rather than the hippocampal-based memories when you do these kinds of experiments.
So you take the emotion out of the memory.
You dampen the emotion so that the person is no longer overwhelmed when they relive, when they have the conscious reliving, which will then trigger all this emotional stuff. You dampen the ability of the brain to re-trigger that underneath stuff that complicates life for them. It doesn't remove the memory, it simply kind of reduces the impact of it.
Is anybody trying to figure out how to do that with the hippocampal episodic, is that right?
Right.
Memory?
Yes, and I would say the evidence is, I mean, there's some studies that, if you target it for that, you can do it. But it's not, it doesn't seem to be quite as robust as the other stuff. And when this has been tried in humans, the effect is that, for example, just using a simple thing in healthy adults, college students, where they see a stimulus that's paired with a shock, and then they're given a drug that blocks the restorage of the memory, they still remember the experience again, but they just don't have the response.
So the memory of the event is intact, but the associated memory, the associated emotion is altered.
Exactly.
I have a hypothetical question for all of you, and then soon we will throw it to the audience here. Presumably, technology will change all kinds of things about how the brain works, about how memory works, as computers are developed to interface with particular neural functions. Maybe certain drugs will enhance memory. Looking into your crystal ball, any guesses as to how memory might change in the future? Will the person 300 years from now have dramatically improved memories?
Well, some people have thought perhaps the opposite is happening because, for example, we rely so much on external storage now. When I ask you, if I ask you a difficult question, about, can you think of a country whose flag is not in a rectangular shape? Maybe at one time people would have started searching for memories. Now most people will think of Google. And there's actually some nice research on this that came out last year, showing through various clever cognitive measures that when you ask people these kinds of questions, the thing that comes to mind really is computers and Google. Those are the things that spring to mind.
Why do we have to store it in our own brains?
We don't have to store it. We don't have to store it in our own brains. But interestingly, that same study showed that even though it looks as though we think about computers and Google when we're given difficult questions, and if we're told that a computer, for example, will save an answer to a difficult question, then we're much less likely to remember it. But we're good at remembering which folder the answer was stored in. So our memories may be adapting so that we don't have to do certain things with our memories, but maybe we'll do other things better. So I don't think it's going to be a straight up or straight down. It'll probably be a little bit more complex as we adapt to available technologies.
Any other thoughts on the future of memory?
Do I have to answer for 300 years, or could it be more like
it can be a
50
shorter.
or 60?
50 years is fine.
Because I think that over the next several decades, we're definitely going to be valuing memory less, memory of information, for exactly the reasons that Dan gave. And if you look at the past several hundred years, that's been the vector. You know, we used to think of intelligence and the ability to remember a lot of information as being one and the same thing. And now we think that's pretty pedantic. We're more interested in how you can use information to make new knowledge.
That's fascinating. So the idea of a good memory was highly valued. Right. I mean, it was part of almost good character.
Yeah, it was absolutely the crucial thing. And there were many. There were whole genres of writing devoted to how to make your memory supreme. That the old notion of the memory palace, that you create a space and you store information, an imaginary space, and you store information in the different places, and then you can walk around in your memory palace to find stuff. That's a technique that's still used by those people who are interested in performing as great memory. Yeah, exactly. But it's a novelty now, whereas it used to be a way that you established yourself as legitimate and as having a powerful mind. And now that's not so valued. And I could imagine in the distant future it could come back, but I think that in the short term it's not going to be valued, because everybody will just use Google and its future forms.
That has an important consequence, which is, you know, as you're maturing, growing up, you're learning cognitive skills that help you do things. And so if you don't develop those memory skills, you're not going to have them later. So it's more profound than simply not using it, I think.
Have any of you tried building memory palaces yourselves?
Sure. I mean, something like it. I was thinking of something else, so let me answer that, and then I'll answer your question. Because the memory palace is really, I mean, we think of, you know, Francis Yates that wrote I think the definitive book on it, and basically you think of like a huge palace with niches all over the place, and you store, it's like folders that you visualize that you're putting information in. But I think that what is really important about memory is how many of you have seen children not know their multiplication tables? Okay. I mean, nobody studies multiplication. 8 times 6, I never learned that, but it was the only one that stomped me. But basically, we don't care about multiplication. Everybody has a calculator. They have phones. End of story. You can go and take exams now with a calculator. But the stuff, there's also an emotional component to memory, which I think is it's not just emotion, it's also aesthetic. And I remember when one of my sons was probably a year and a half, he could already speak pretty well, and I would go to the supermarket with him, and in the bodega that became a supermarket later, they had all the spices, all of them in huge bottles, and you could just open them up. And I decided, this is interesting, teach him the smells of every single spice. And of course, he did. Because Daddy wanted him to, yes, but because he learned to like that sort of stuff. And I think he will progress into a human being who stores aesthetic moments with a great deal of gusto. I don't know that we do that much. I mean, many kids now know who played what on which baseball game and who won and who batted what. And people know this information. But that's not because of the numbers that it's interesting, but because there's an emotional component to it, which I think is so important. And we don't want to lose that, obviously.
I have a related prediction, which is that as our valuing of itty-bitty precise bits of memory goes down, I don't know whether it's related, but our valuing of forgetting is going to go up. That I think that at the moment, or recently, there's been a lot of ambivalence about whether it would actually be a good thing to dampen emotional memory. And people who work with trauma, with people who suffer from PTSD, have said, of course it is. If you're suffering from PTSD, you really want this. But it used to be the case that people thought, well, the better you understand an experience, the better for you, because then you'll understand it better and you'll be emotionally stronger as a result, and that's shifting. But I expect it's going to shift a lot more in the future, and people will think it's very quaint to think that we should try to remember even the bad stuff.
Wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, André Aciman, Joseph LeDoux, Daniel Schacter, Alison Winter.